Το πρόσωπο και ο Eros is a very complex book. It has a simple soul but a very articulated body. Here we are, the Greek edition, then the English translation by Norman Russell, and finally the German edition. It is expedient, in my opinion, to manage all these editions, for each contributes to the understanding of the whole work. The English book is a good version, however, it has a consistent limit. The sources are quoted with no use of Greek character. This monolinguism does reduce the impact. By the way, Greek is a language spoken by Yanaras when he commends Aristotle and Gregory of Nyssa or Maximus the Confessor. Also, the German edition is useful, for it permits to discover some subtle lines which connect the language Yanaras thought in, while he interpreted the thought of Martin Heidegger, another influential author who inspired this great book. The better should be reading To Prosopo και ο Eros as a synoptical work. In this short talk, I will limit myself to some remarks about the point of view of a student of the semiotics and the philosophy of language. I will trace a sort of back cover of the book by using my personal memories. When Yanaras' book Person and Eros was published in Greece, and some years later it appeared also in Germany and in Great Britain, the philosophical landscape of linguistics and semiotics was dominated in the Western Academy by a bundle of key notions. On the one side, code, system, phonemes, competence, performance. On the other side, meaning, truth, predicate, inference, and so on. No one among these terms was related to person or to Eros. Semiotics sprang from a vision of beings mostly grounded on the notion of negativity. The structure of phonological systems was overimposed throughout in the human sciences. Ferdinand de Saussure claimed that defining an entity in a language is the same as differentiating it from any other entity in that language. In French terms, this sounded dans la langue, il n'y a que deux différences. Notions as that of phoneme, signifier, reference, or code were supposed to describe a sort of castle with no inhabitants, a building where no real speakers were expected to live. So conceived, languages were similar to an algebraic construction. Even the articulatory position involved in the process of voice production were taken as just the maps of a virtual machinery to be activated by some speaker. The field was not very different in that time as for the analytic philosophy. The kernel was the notion of sentence, still better, the notion of open sentence, which is the same as a notion of predicate with a blank in it for its variables. Open sentences are per se neither true nor false. They are simply insaturated. As for the phoneme, so for the predicate, the analyst copes with the formal and conceptual atoms belonging to a sort of calculus. What happened in this landscape about persons and Eros? What about the word emerging as the limit of our language, as Wittgenstein claimed? Languages were conceived of as algebraic forms. They seemed forms covering several matters, forms shaping accident occurring to things, neither persons that exist nor eros. Of course, both semiotics and analytic philosophy had different pretensions, but they shared one and a common task: to explain language, to explain human communication, to explain practices and usages in an immanent way, without any reference to what exists outside the language. In French theory, this sounds like il n'y a pas de hors texte. For instance, this view of language had many limits. First, it did not deal with voice. Voice was taken as a variable element. This now appears as it really is a mistake. For if language is what becomes open between phone and logos, between the animal Umwelt and the human Welt, then such a difference does matter. The philosophical approach to voice is an ontological eye-opener. I think Jan Ra's book did formulate the right questions in order to suggest how to abandon the restricted field of analytic and semiotic formulations emerging in that time. The negativity scrutinized by the scholars of language was pervasive. Not only the human languages, but also the word was considered as a nihilistic construction, still better, as a mere effect of language. Reality, truth, the word as such did appear as fictive as the object of a theory. Quine for the one side and Greimas for the other side were the mentors of this view. These forms of thought were of course not born in the contemporary age. Person and eros, το πρόσωπο και ο eros, was exactly the unexpected revelation of a sense in this path. And Jan Ras was the first author whose work permitted to reconstruct and understand this process, mostly unaware for a lot of us at that time. In that book, Jan Ras explained that the semiotic view of conceptuality was a product of the Western reading of Aristotle's ontology. This reading separated the words of philosophy from the common reality, the concepts from the world where they were born and where they were familiar with the things. Jan Ras explained that there was something wrong also in the hylomorphic principle commonly accepted by the semioticians since the Saussure, and especially after the influential work of Louis Hjelmslo. Hylomorphism aims at considering every being as composed of matter and form. The matter is envisaged as subjugated to the form as a variable is respect to the invariant. So conceived, the matter works just as a substrate, the hypokeimenos, to which the form gives shape. There is something wrong in this hylomorphism, as Martin Heidegger remarked. Jan Ras argues that this model came to modern scholars through the corruption of the late scholastics. In fact, the hylomorphic pair ended to become the very general model for understanding every being in the world. Hylomorphism influenced, during the Middle Ages, the Latin language logic grounded on the crucial notion of suppositio. The medieval philosophers and the modern philosophers, too, studied in this way the what of language, discarding the mode of language, that is, the how in which language exists in human communities. This book was a sort of inventory of the mistakes in Western philosophy, in semiotics, and also in the analytic way to approach languages and especially ontology. Jan Eras, well grounded on knowledge of the Greek fathers, was not a personalist, was not like the French philosophers. He had no particular interest in founding the ontic level of the person, but he had interest in the ontological level of person. He moved from the ontological difference established by Martin Heidegger, and he placed a similar ontological device in the field of ergon and energia. The so-called secular age is the age of no-liturgies. Instead of the living usages of symbols, it posed the corpses, the dead signs. It was a sort of linguistic entomology. At the end, Jan Eras posed in this book the basis for a new philosophical approach, and he rescued the study of ontology and the study of language by unifying three landscapes. First, he rescued the study of the signifier. The signifier was interesting in that time for Lacan, for the psychoanalysis, but linguists were very skeptical about him. He valued, second, the field of the art. And finally, third, he stressed the notion of logos, and he brought this notion at the center of his investigation. The logos was not yet for Jan Eras an object to analyze. It was the signifier that is manifest as a disclosure of the logos of beings in the dimension of the person. The person became not only a term for a relationship, but the recapitulation of the ontology. The logos is such a disclosure, and is not a movement made by the subject, by the ontic subject. The disclosure is the link, the logos, connecting persons, and it works as a universal link. The dimension of person is universal, and this happens for the existential universally became in Jan Eras the fact itself of the person. Truth ceases to be the property of a sentence or of a proposition. It is not just linked with signs of human behavior. Truth is a sort of being aware of the common life. Alethewein is the same as being in a true relation with others. Logos is not an object that every individual studies ad libitum. It is a relation in which persons are involved. It is a part of their lives. It is the recapitulation of the logoi of the beings thanks to the logos of truth offered to mankind by Jesus Christ. This perspective is not immanentistic. It uses the transcendent elements of language and knowledge and proposes a view that is at the same time ecstatic and hypostatic. Ecstatic because the subject is not only hypokeimenos, but is involved in a relation. It cannot escape this relation apart from when it falls. And this is hypostatic because hypostasis is what manifests the person in the world and manifests the person as the true subject, existing and taking care of the world as such in a personal way. I thank Jan Eras for writing this book. I thank Sotiris for inviting me to give my opinion on this. Thank you very much.